Good afternoon and welcome to our New York Archives Magazine online speaker series. I'm Josie Madison, editor of New York Archives. Today, we are joined by Dr. Christy Fragnoli, Jennifer Hesselteen, Lavada Nahan, and Jordan Jace for our program History Education, bringing history organizations and educators together. Dr. Christy Fragnoli is president of the New York Council for History Education and a professor in the Lally School of Education at the College of St. Rose. She has over 10 years of public school teaching experience. Dr. Fragnoli taught as an assistant professor at the State University at Cortland and was an adjunct at Syracuse University while finishing her doctoral degree at Binghamton University. In addition to serving as a consultant for the New York State Archives, she is a member of the New York State Education Department Content Advisory Board for Social Studies and also a very valued member of our editorial consultant board for the magazine. Jennifer Hesselteen is the NYCHE North Country Liaison and K-12 education consultant and strategist. As a former teacher and present-day designer of learning experiences for both students and teachers, her overall purpose is to inspire a love of learning well beyond the walls of a classroom or covers of a textbook. The present-day K-12 education environment informs her ideas and services. Lavada Nahan is the interpreter of African American history for NYS OPRHP Bureau of Historic Sites and a culinary historian focused on the 17th through 19th centuries Mid-Atlantic region with an emphasis on the work of enslaved cooks in the homes of the elite class. She is also a generalist in New York African American history 19th through 20th century. She has 20 plus years of public history experience working with a variety of historic sites, societies, and museums across the tri-state region. Jordan Jace is the Assistant Director of Education at the Archives Partnership Trust. A researcher, writer, project manager, and educator, Jordan has extensive knowledge and familiarity with using historical resources, including documents, artifacts, and historic sites, for educational purposes. Their work experience includes 6 years as a professional archaeologist and 4 years as a secondary social studies teacher. Jordan is also the statewide coordinator for the New York Council for History Education, the New York State Archives Student Research Awards program, and the newly launched ConsiderTheSourceNewYork.org Diversity and Collaborative Knowledge Project. And just a bit of housekeeping for all of you who joined us today, there will be a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. So feel free to submit questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many of those as we can at the end of the presentation. And without further ado, I am pleased to introduce Jordan Jace.
Hello, thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Josie, for the introductions. I'm just going to start us off here with giving you all a brief overview of the programming that we're now doing here at the New York State Archives and the Archives Partnership Trust with regards to educators and building a network across the state of educators and key stakeholders, of which our other 3 panelists here today are representative of those groups. So they'll be providing those perspectives as they each present about their work in this project. So I've shared my screen here. This is the website that we launched about a year and a half ago, I would say. It's Consider the Source New York, ConsiderTheSourceNY.org is the address. It's free use for anybody. Register for an account. You can browse historical records, access learning activities, build and share learning activities. It's mainly geared towards K-12 educators, but I think anybody interested in local history and primary sources would find the resources that we have available on here very interesting and educational. The website allows us to have a place to put primary sources from across the state. So we don't just have New York State Archives primary sources on here. We also have many from repositories throughout the state. We've recently launched a new initiative funded by the Institute for Museum and Library Services, Consider the Source New York Diversity and Collaborative Knowledge Program. And what that does is it allows us to create that network in the 9 regions across the state of educators, school librarians, public librarians, archivists, historians, any stakeholders in history education interested in working with the other professions to increase access to primary sources to educators and students throughout the state. The website allows us to have a place to put all of those resources and make them readily available in a format that allows teachers to create their own learning activities or take a learning activity created by another educator and edit it and make it their own to bring it into their classroom. They can share it directly with other educators and also with their students through Google Classroom. And it is the education law 2D compliant, so we do not collect any personal information or student data on the website. If a student completes an activity on the website, they save it as a PDF and then submit it to their teacher. And they can put it into other formats as well once they save it as a PDF. So we have don't collect any of that data, and we will sign a third-party contract for educators for districts if they need us to do that, stating that we don't collect any data. So it's a great resource. I want to just show you a couple things about it before we move on to the other panelists. When they browse, you can browse by many different things: topic, historical era, primary source type, and region. As we do this project that we're doing with the diversity and collaborative knowledge, we are partnering with more repositories throughout the state so that there will be more regional primary sources available to teachers. We find, and I know when I was in the classroom, students love seeing primary sources from their backyard, recognizing street names and family names and places that are part of their local community. They realize that history does happen in your local communities that is connected to state, national, and global events. So we are making every effort to include more local primary sources through this new initiative that we have launched. Just as an example, I can click on topic African Americans. As you can see right now, we have 54 documents related to African American history that have been tagged that way. It's all through a tagging system. And I'm just going to call up the Act for Gradual Abolition, which is a New York State Archives document. It was the document, that legal document that began the end of slavery in New York State. It did not end it immediately, but put in place a system to end it. You can see here we have a place for transcripts. Most students do not read cursive. I've heard not even graduate students serving as interns at some repositories know cursive, much to the disappointment of the repository. So we do try to provide a transcript for every document, a page by page, so that the student sees the original as they see the transcription of the document right next to it. So that is an added benefit. So teachers don't have to worry about that added step. Now, if there is a learning activity already created using this document, it appears at the bottom of the screen here. So a teacher could click on this and it would take them right to a learning activity that includes this document. We do have one about slavery in New York, the history of it. And so if they click on there, it takes them to, and I think Christy will talk about this document a little bit later. But you can see the student view is here. There's lots of things you can do on the back end as the teacher. But it just makes it easier for teachers to bring these valuable primary sources into their classroom, create questions. They can edit this in any way that they want. They can call up the document like this, and then they can read the transcription like that. So it really does facilitate the use of these documents in the classroom. And they can also build from scratch. So that is here. So I encourage you all, if you want to register for an account, you can go on there and play and take a look. Anybody can browse. You don't need an account to browse the documents, but in order to save the learning activities and share them with your students, you will need to register for an account. And if you do, you get a free year digital subscription through the website to New York Archives magazine. So you get access to the full magazine through there. But the main thing we want to talk about today is the importance of this network. So all of these key stakeholders, historians, repositories, educators, all coming together to talk about how students use primary sources, how teachers use primary sources, and why they are so important to bring into the classroom for civic literacy, just for critical thinking. We talk about students being able to look at a source, a modern day source, news source online and say, is it reliable? Is it valid? How do you do that type of work? What skills are involved? Primary sources are key to teaching those skills. And our panelists today will talk a little bit more about that. I won't take up any more of your time, as I feel like the other three here have Very valuable things to tell you, but I do encourage you to check out the resources that we do have available now, and stay tuned for more as we continue with the project that we currently have going. Thank you.
Hello. Once again, just to refresh a little bit, my name is Dr. Christy Fragnoli, and I've been at College of St. Rose for 19 years working with pre-service teachers, getting them ready to have their own classroom. Thank you, Jordan, for such a great summary about this resource. This is truly a statewide network and a national resource. Anyone can tap into this, and it allows for current teachers and pre-service teachers, the people that I work with getting ready to have their own classroom. It allows them to bring authentic, easily obtainable, real pieces of history. Those pieces we call primary documents. We can bring them into the classroom. Now, why is this so important? Well, first of all, as we all know, teachers do not have the time. They don't have the time to go out in search of and find those documents that are sort of close to home, but represent national issues. When Jordan showed the page of all the information, how it's developed through theme and time period, all those, it is a wealth. It's like a toolbox of resources that teachers and pre-service teachers can use to pull from. Fantastic. But we also find that primary documents, when we bring them into the classroom, it allows for voices to be heard. All voices that you don't find in a textbook. I want my future teachers to be able to do this, to be able to pick and choose these silenced voices and share with their students in the classroom. So let's think about this for a second and see if we could come up with maybe an example so that you can have an image in your mind. So maybe we're looking at a journal or a diary entry of a young female at a specific time in history. Well, what do we find out when maybe we read a personal journal? We find out their opinions, their views, their daily chores, their activities, things they can do, things they can't do. That tiny document may offer such a full glimpse of what society is like during that time. It is a perfect primary document to bring into the classroom. Here's another example. What about if we're looking at separate but equal during the time period, and we bring in a map and we look at school districts and how they're defined? Now that's one primary document, great visual for us to see. We may also want to bring in other documents, maybe school inventories to look at materials and resources, all to layer and create a historical context or a view of what that time period was like for people during that time within that specific time period. So here's my challenge to you. Can you think of possibly a primary document that we might want to bring into a classroom that will give voice to a silenced person in history? Think for a second. I told you a journal and a map. Two very easy documents. Can you come up with one? If you can, type it in the chat and we'll get back to that. I'm going to keep talking as we go. Now, we use these pieces of evidence to allow our students to become historians. When I work with pre-service teachers, my goal is to help them design lessons that allow students to acquire these skills to become historians. So how does this happen? Yeah, we hand out primary documents, but we can't just leave our students alone. We have to help them develop these skills. We are asking them to pull apart a document. That's called sourcing. We ask for the who, what, where, why, when of that document. That's the natural questions that come to be. But we have to ask what other questions come to mind as you're looking at these documents. And students create full lists of questions based on the document. We also have to help students explore the time period that the document was created. Think about it. The historical context of the time of when the document was created is key to understanding what was happening in society. Why was that document created? What was the purpose? What was the intended audience? All of those are so important to understand. Now, do you get all this from reading a chapter in a textbook? No. Or answering the questions at the end of the chapter? Absolutely not. Really, this becomes a game. We're solving a mystery. We're unraveling history by asking these questions and researching, trying to answer them. Students slowly develop and acquire the skills of a historian. They start to probe. Remember, we don't teach math. 1 + 1 is 2 in math, and it's always the same answer. History, we have no true answers. So it's so important that they ask questions and dig and constantly build and layer these primary documents so they keep getting a clearer, richer view of what's happening during the time. Additionally, we have to think about all of our students, right? So as a pre-service, as a teacher that works with pre-service teachers, it's really important that my students are able to work with all sorts of learners during this time. So maybe English as a new language student. Well, bringing in a photo, a picture, a painting allows everyone an even playing field. All students can analyze and contribute and add to the information by analyzing that. As Jordan showed you when you saw Consider the Source, there are many strategies that this website and teachers are able to use to allow those difficult text documents, to allow those for struggling readers, non-English language learners, all different types of learners can do well with primary documents based on different strategies that we can use. And Consider the Source gives us many strategies that we can use. So did anyone come up with some primary sources? Let me just check that chat box. Oh, fantastic. Oh, a family Bible. That is a great one. There's tons of information that we can explore in a family Bible. Oh, I love that one. New York Constitution. Hey, we're going to talk about some legislation later, and New York Constitution might be a good one to pull in. Family banking records. Absolutely. Inventories, wills, tons of information on all those. Oh, I am so thrilled. Excellent job on those. Okay, let's take a second and take a look at an actual sample of a primary document that we might use in a pre-service classroom. Hold on, I'm just going to share my screen. And Jordan already showed us a quick glimpse of this document. Okay, can we see it? Just give me a nod, Jordan, that you can see my shared document. Okay, beautiful. I just want to go through it. Okay, now typically I would, of course, fire out questions for my pre-service teachers, but in this situation, because of the chat, I'm going to give you 2 questions that you can type and work up on. First of all, we know that this document is a slave ad, and I'm going to go through and source it slightly for us first. We see Kingston, New York. Okay, New York State, Kingston's not far away from Albany. We might want to bring in a map to show students depending upon age. We see September and we see the year 1823. So we know it's an ad. Okay, here's my question to you that you can type into the chat. Where in 1823 would I find this ad? Okay, that's number 1 question. And number 2, describe the intended audience. All right, who would read this? Okay, see if you can answer that and throw that in the chat. You really made me happy in the last chat, so keep going. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the ad and then we're going to just talk about it slightly. And remember, this is a small sample of what we would do in a classroom with pre-service teachers preparing them. Okay, runaway Negro, the subscriber's Negro man, Bob, having run away, I hereby forbid all persons to harbor or employ him, as I am determined to prosecute every person or persons so injuring me. John Sauser, Kingston, September 17th, 1823. Okay, tons of information jumps off of this ad. We know that historical context is going to have to be a huge piece of this lesson, right? We got to talk about the language that's used in the ad. We got to talk about vocabulary. Depending upon the age, subscriber, they might not know that's the owner. What about Bob? No last name. Now, why no last name, right? It's to look at it as in taking away personal identity. So there is only one name on that. Okay, so let's go back to the chat. How did we do on? Ooh, tons. Oh my gosh, you're the best audience ever. Could you like all join my class at St. Rose? Because I love people that volunteer. Okay, yes, posted at a post office or public square. Excellent. Probably people seeking runaways so they know who to look for to get rewards. Yes, now the person that wrote that, Bria, thank you. Notice this one didn't have a reward listed. We're going to look at another fast one that did. Newspaper advertisement. Yes, this is where this one actually came from, a newspaper advertisement. Wonderful. Intended for general audience. Yes, because of the bottom line was wherever this person was passing through, they wanted to make sure that they knew that this person was missing. But a huge piece of this ad we've got to talk about is tone, right? Let's look at the wording on this. There are a couple of things that really jump off. Anyone, I forbid no person to harbor or employ. Now, why would you put that in the ad? Anyone harboring or employing will get prosecuted. It is injuring me. So tone is loud and clear in this. You know, as a person today reading this ad, knowing that the ad was written in 1823, it really starts to say, you know, what does this ad say about what is going to happen to the slave when returned? Okay, so in addition to tone, we also have to talk about and recognize the bias in the ad, right? Perspective. Okay, this is written from a very specific perspective for a very particular purpose, and you are all really clear about the audience. The tactic that was used was in order for the owner to reclaim the people they consider to be his or her property. So the tone was very loud and clear. We have to work through that with our students. Now, sometimes you notice that the ad omits tons of information. So the students start questioning as they read this. Okay, well, where is he going? Does he have family? What skills does he have? How is he treated? Why is he leaving? Okay, they develop a series of questions. Now comes the historical research piece. You turn it back on the student and you say, where can we get additional information on this? How do we start to understand this? Some students may even say, wait, New York State, slavery? We're a northern state. It's 1823. Did that really exist? So we can start to peel it back. Now, when Jordan started to look at Consider the Source, Jordan showed legislation. We could send our students out and about to actually research and find the legislation that follows in New York State. So notice 1799 to 1827, small little tweaks are made along the way in legislation. But the bottom line, yes, in 1823, slaves were in New York State. And Kingston, if we do some local diving into Kingston, Kingston was like an Ellis Island of the slave trade. Over 900,000 slaves were brought in through that Kingston area, all starting from 1692 up to 1808. That is a tremendous amount of history within one area that we can delve into and see what else we could find to understand this time period. We might also want to look at other ads and start to see patterns. It's almost like a template when you start to look. Now, this one is Milton, Boston Spa in New York State, but two different locations. This one's a little bit earlier, 1809. We can have our students go back to the laws again and legislation and understand it. This one has a little bit more description, about 5 feet 8 or 9 inches high, stout, thick set, well-made. Well-made is a table, not a person. We've got to talk about language, bias, perspective, all in pulling apart these ads. So triangulation is important. Bringing in multiple pieces of documents so students can start to understand the historical context, the time period when these were made and what was happening. There's a lot of information in this one small ad that we can have discussions with students. These ads offer clues about heartbreaking personal stories of those who were enslaved and sought their freedom. Taken together, they illuminate the sweep and the scope of slavery and its tremendous human cost during this time in history. So it's really important that we bring these documents into the classroom so that we can understand empathy, skills, and we have to remember that knowledge is power, and we have to help our students to acquire that. I teach on a college level, preparing pre-service teachers, getting them ready for their own classroom. Consider the source as a resource that brings together historians, librarians, museum people, archivists, educators. You know the saying, it takes a village to raise a child. Well, this is a perfect example of the best way to educate a child. It takes everyone. And I know it is a bit of a scary time in education. We need to prepare our students for the world. We need to create savvy citizens, citizens that are able to question, think, problem solve, and communicate. And this is how we do it, using the village of resources and people, using authentic pieces of history to explore and bring silenced voices into this educational arena. It might be a bit of a scary time in education, but it's also an exciting time, and it's really a time to make a great difference. So thanks for letting me share some examples, and I hope you have like an idea of what happens in a college classroom as we prepare future educators for elementary, middle school, and high school classrooms.
Thank you, Christy. I think we'll pass it off to Jennifer Hesselteen now.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Christy. I think your activity is actually a great segue into the 3 points that I'd really like to make with regards to K-12 education. So my background is of a social studies teacher and a curriculum coordinator at the middle school level for social studies, and now as a K-12 education consultant who spends plenty of time in classrooms with educators, with our K-12 teachers currently. So that activity, Christy, that you just had us do, and the information that sort of came along with it, really has me thinking about the shifts overall in K-12 education that are happening right now, and have been happening actually. If you look at our K-12 learning standards, not just in social studies education across New York State, but more broadly, our K-12 learning standards in science, in math, in social studies, what you see is a real shift toward inquiry, curiosity, encouraging students to be curious and inquisitive, right? And giving them those opportunities. There's an overall shift in all of these learning standards toward not just memorization, and a little bit away from memorization and more toward inquiry, having students engage in what's being learned, right? Learning not just content, but key skills. And when we think about that, we really think about the students doing the doing. I love, there was the New York State Teacher of the Year in 2013, Greg Alquist, who's a current social studies teacher. He had said in a recent PD that he did with teachers, it's not solely about the knowing anymore. Now it's about the doing. Right? It's about getting our students doing things like the activity that Christy just did with all of us. And an activity like that can be done across K-12 at all grade levels and in all content areas, right? Not just social studies. So really the first point that I really want to make is just really considering this overall shift in education and K-12 education toward inquiry and curiosity. And why is that there's this shift that's happening toward engaging students in some hands-on learning, right? And not just memorization, but really engaging them in being curious and in being inquisitive, right? And having them gather the information rather than us always telling them about the information. And I think if we stop and think about the lives that our K-12 students are living right now, they have information coming at them all the time in a variety of different ways. Access to information is not the problem with our K-12 students. They have too much information coming at them. So for them, it's about, what do I do with this information? What do I gather from this, right? Think about a simple newscast, or if you're a student, a K-12 student, you might be scrolling on your phone through a whole bunch of information that's coming at you. So now the shift is giving them the skills, right, to be able to question, to be able to say, what am I seeing? Who wrote this? Who's giving it to me? What is their perspective? Whose perspective is missing? That's such a key critical question, right? What bias is here? So many, where did this come from? Where was this produced? What might be the bias of the person who's giving this to me? Is this even real? Right? So, there's all of these things. And so really, information, our students' access to information isn't the issue, right? What we really need to be doing with students in K-12 is making sure that they have the skills to be able to gather information, decipher what's fact from fiction, be able to gather their own information, right, from what is coming at them, and be able to communicate that back out. So it's a real shift, and it's purposeful, right? It's intentional. We need to meet up with the students that we have in our classrooms today. So that's really the first point. Second point is, we hear this sort of cliche now, right? We have all these buzzwords in education, one of them being 21st century skills, right? So the second point that I really want to make is just, what does it mean to have 21st century skills, right? And also consider, we're like a quarter of a way through the 21st century. So, giving our students opportunities to be historians now, not in the future, right? Giving them those opportunities to be the historian now, to grapple with history now by engaging with artifacts, engaging with audio files, engaging with primary source documents, will help to build those 21st century skills, right? That need to be happening now. Again, we're a quarter of the way almost through the 21st century. So really thinking, in K-12 education, but more broadly in our communities, what are our 21st century skills, right? The Partnership for 21st Century Learning has an initiative called Profile of a Graduate. And Profile of a Graduate is really thinking about backward design, starting with our 12th graders, right? Starting with those students in our districts, in our schools who are going to graduate, the profile of a graduate. In your communities, what does that profile look like? What are those skills that we want students leaving us with, right? When they graduate from our schools, when they graduate from our school districts, what are those skills that they need now and they may need in the future? And how can we get them there? And what Profile of a Graduate does is it starts with that end in mind. And then you back that out, right? All the way through K through 12, you're intentionally ensuring that students graduate and move on in the world with key skills that are, have been intentionally offered up to students for them to grow and learn all the way up through, so that we can send them out into the world with 21st century skills. And what are those skills? Right? Tiffany Schlain, who's the founder of the Webby Awards, has an outstanding video clip where she calls our economy now and the economy of the future, the human economy. And the human economy is an economy that depends on the pure authenticity of human beings, what we have to offer, right? We know that technology is here to stay, right? So we as humans really have to think, when we're thinking about 21st century skills that are important, what is it that humans can offer that technology can't, right? So 21st century skills and the human economy really is very likely going to be centered around curiosity, making sure our citizens now and in the future are curious. Technology can't be curious. We can train it, right? We can program it, but really being innately curious That can't happen. Only humans can do that, right? So we need our kids to be curious. We need them to dig and ask questions, not just to be fed information. They have plenty of that. You know, empathy, right, is another one that Tiffany Schlein points out. Empathy is purely human, right? Being empathetic. You know, giving students opportunities to practice that, to look at a document, an artifact, hear an audio file, primary source from the past, right? And be able to empathize with the folks who were there at the time and try to understand it and grapple with it, right? It brings out that human quality of empathy and allows our students in K-12 an opportunity to practice it. And so, you know, just really thinking about, when we're thinking about 21st century skills, really thinking about what are our human qualities that we know, right? That can't be taken over by technology, can't be replaced by technology. We know technology can do the rote tasks, okay? We know that humans have empathy. We know humans have curiosity, okay? We know humans can solve problems. So just the second point, really be thinking about that as well, right? 21st century skills, and what does that mean for our kids now? And how do connections between educators and our history organizations, our museums, our parks across New York State, how does all of that bring out the opportunity for our students to practice these key 21st century skills that we know are important? Okay. The last point that I just want to make, you know, how do we ensure that students learn these 21st century skills in our classrooms? It's about using a variety of resources. It's about connecting to community, right? It's not about being in a silo just in K-12 in our schools. It's about connecting to our historical organizations, our museums, our communities, right? And using the resources and tapping into the many resources that are available in our communities, and in our communities across New York State, and giving our students opportunities to practice those key skills, right? You know, through those connections. You know, I know, Christy, you mentioned, you know, the textbook, right? And solely learning from the textbook. I think it's key to remember that a textbook has covers, right? There's a start and a finish, and that's not everything that's in between, right? There's so much missing in a textbook. So ensuring that we use a variety of resources, you know, with our students, artifacts, putting them in touch with folks far and wide, right? And making sure that they have opportunities to engage with folks in school, outside of their communities, and even within their communities, and making sure that they have opportunities to engage with primary source documents, and just a variety of resources. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here today. I'm going to turn it over to you, Lavada, now.
Thank you. I started out with the idea that I was going to play off what Christy and Jennifer shared. So I do want to take a moment to step back to the ads that Christy put out and some of the things that came up in the chat. So when she was asking for different resources, one of the things that I thought was great was the Family Bible. But that's also a resource that we really don't find in the 18th, 19th century Black environment. And one of the challenges is our previous education around Southern laws and literacy. There is a belief for many that the enslaved were not allowed to read and write. In fact, there are no slave codes in New York around literacy. So we end up with an extreme. For instance, Sojourner Truth, who only spoke one language and was illiterate, is a contemporary of Jupiter Hammond, a man who was the first Black published poet in our country, who was enslaved on Long Island, who was literate enough, one, to be his enslaver's secretary, but also the teacher of the enslaver's kids. So we have those extremes. One of the things around the absence of the Bibles is not literacy, but wealth. Many of enslaved are not given anything when they are freed. So we have 19th century documents that speak to them about being poor, being thieves. So we have to always remember the social context in which we are using these documents. What pertains to those here in New York and what does not? When we looked at that ad from 1823, you notice there weren't a lot of details and there was not a reward. We see that more and more as we go towards the end of enslavement, because one of the things that many people are not aware of in New York, you can't just free an enslaved person. There are laws that oversee how that person is freed, that they have to be inspected by the overseers of the poor. They have to be deemed fit. If they're not deemed fit, then the enslaver must take care of them for the rest of their lives. Again, those 19th century sources often will say, well, my Uncle Joe So took care of his enslaved people when they were elderly. Well, yeah, he did, because it was the law. One of the things that we also have to consider as we go forth are all of these little things. One of the challenges we have right now, particularly around teaching enslavement in New York, is getting the laws, rules, and regulations and the presence of New York out from under what most of us learned growing up in school. And that includes most of our teachers. If you were part of New York educational system within the last 7 to 10 years, what you learned around enslavement in New York is very different than what many parents grew up learning, what many of us as professionals even grew up learning. So part of that is also about using Consider the Source New York, not just for your students, but also for your own re-education. It is putting current research out there for everyone, and that includes us, because how enslavement happened here in New York is very different than how it happened in the South and even how it happened above us. Many people I saw in the chat said that a lot of people don't know that enslavement happened in New York, but also a lot of people are not aware that New York was the second largest slave market in the 13 colonies. So we are literally talking about thousands of people, not held on plantations, but in fact, 2 out of every 3 households, 2 out of every 4 farms, large manor system, 2 million acres all over our state where enslaved people were working. So it is about all of us, particularly in this one narrow area, having to use sources like Consider the Source to go back and re-educate ourselves so that we can step out and help the students understand what is happening, to pull New York history out from under Southern history. So I really, and there was also a question of what do you have students reading before and after? And I have spoken to a lot of people who are saying they're using the 1619 project. That is a wonderful project, but unfortunately, most of it doesn't apply to New York. So again, we have to be really aware. So Slavery in New York is a great resource. It's a book based on a 3-year exhibit that happened at the New York Historical Society. There are a number of books. In the Shadow of Slavery speaks to enslavement, again, in New York. The work of A.J. Williams Myers speaks to enslavement here in the Hudson River Valley. So there are a number of resources available and books that are easy to use and adapt. We are, however, in need of a lot more books around specifically New York enslaved history. So this is a dance and a conversation that I am having all over. In fact, it was a conversation I just had 2 days ago around Sojourner Truth when someone spoke to her being illiterate and being a Dutch speaker. Most people find that she's in the South, but this is where the importance of historians is in play, whether that is someone at a historic site like myself, who's working on the state level. New York State owns, the Parks Department owns 34 historic sites. 12 of which are in the enslaved period. So you can find recent research, new interpretations. Those are great sources, but you also have other sources in things like your town historians, your county historians. Those are people who can come into your classroom and help you work with your students, bring in those visuals that are readily available that have not been digitized yet. So they give you some wonderful things to do, a lot of people for you to work with. Now, as a culinary historian, when we were practicing, there was oh, Levada, can you share something? And one of the things, I'm gonna see if I can share my screen here. Okay, so what we have here is a very simple recipe for cornbread. The ingredients for a simple cornbread actually relate heavily to New York history. 17th, 18th, into the 19th century, cornmeal, indigenous from the natives, an indigenous crop here, gets quickly adapted by Europeans when they come here. Cornmeal gets transferred to Africa to feed the enslaved on their way back, and is having currently a major impact because it's so easy to grow on African farmers refusing to go back to growing their native grains, which are more nutritious than cornmeal. So you can link it to history, but you can also link it to current scientific and agricultural issues around food here in our world. Flour. Flour was New York's #1 export, right? That's what we're doing. Once we go out of the fur trade, we're sending flour across the ocean. We're sending flour into the Caribbean and West Indies to feed thousands of enslaved. Everybody knows about sugar, but people want to say that sugar was expensive. In fact, most of New York's elite families were dealing in sugar or had family members in the West Indies and Caribbean who owned sugar plantations. Salt. Salt is expensive until we find salt mines here in New York. Butter and milk, again, those exports. Eggs, things that are common, but chickens are not indigenous to this country. They were brought here. Cows were brought here. So we can talk so much using these things. And recipes are really, really popular. One of the sources that I came across in researching this was an article that was in the Washington Post talking about literally using recipes. And I love the fact that for a science activity, they had people making a pavlova. A pavlova is one of my favorite desserts, but it's a cake made with egg whites, right? Egg whites are your friend on a non-humid day. On a humid day, you are not getting pavlova, you're getting a mess. So it is about taking things, and to help many students think about primary documents, one of the things I ask them often, does your grandmother, your mother have a recipe box? That own family's collection of recipes are primary documents. And those are the things that make it real for students, something that they can create. They can step into a holiday meal and say, Mom, can you help me write that down? Can I videotape you when you're doing this? So they're creating that for themselves. So there's a lot of wonderful possibilities using recipes that can connect us really from the beginning through the colonial period, all the way up to the food deserts that many neighborhoods and many kids are struggling with today. So there's a range of wealth to be had and used. So I'm going to stop talking and let us go to that Q&A.
Thanks so much, Levada. That was really great to see how much you could pull out of a recipe. We do have a couple of questions, and if anybody out there still has any questions, you have a minute to get those in. But I wanted to start with one question was about the books, Levada, that you were mentioning that do talk about enslavement in New York State particularly. And I don't know if you want to list them all here, or maybe we can include them in a follow-up email to people who joined us today.
We'll do a follow-up email because there are one that just came out this year that I feel is really important by Dr. Andrea Mosterman, Spaces of Enslavement. One of the challenges that many people have around enslavement is because we don't have slave cabins, right? So you don't have the cabins, you don't have the plantations, you think they're not there. Or in fact, we know that the enslaved lived within their owners' homes. And this speaks to that, and that's new scholarship. And so I'll put together a short bibliography you can share.
That's great, thank you. We had a question also for Jennifer about, Jennifer, you talked a lot about a profile of a graduate. Is that something that is a statewide sort of template, or is that developed by each school or district, or how does that work?
So no, that actually is an initiative from the Partnership for 21st Century Learning, but there are school districts across New York that have adopted that. And in doing that, they've reached out to their community members and the folks within their own districts and education organizations to really work together to decide what does that profile of a graduate look like in our community? What are we hoping for our students by the time they leave us, right, after high school graduation? So no, I don't believe it's a New York State initiative. It is an initiative of the Partnership for 21st Century Learning. And like I said, there are districts and schools that have adopted it across New York.
Great. We have a question also about how can local repositories get their materials up on Consider the Source? Jordan?
So the best thing to do after this would be to email me, and I can email you, or talk to you more information. We do have funding available. We've divided the state into 9 regions. So we have 9 regional teams that are helping us with digitization and training the educators. But so if you already have things digitized that you want to get up on Consider the Source, that'll be pretty simple. So I can talk to you about that. But if you need help digitizing or creating metadata for that information, we also have funds to help you with that. So I'll put my contact information in the chat box, and you can just reach out directly to me, and we can go from there.
Thank you. I also have a question about, we've talked a lot about digitization and 21st century skills. And is there still, and this is a question for all of you, is there still a place for students putting their hands on the original document? Is there a place for students visiting repositories and seeing how they're organized?
Yes, there are, but one must be trained in handling primary documents. That is the catch. Of the sensitive items in most repositories, paper is number 1. Textiles are number 2. So it is a training process. So they can go, they can see them, but generally while they are there visiting with those documents, the professional in the space will actually be doing the handling, because of the sensitivity of aged paper.
I would add, so 2 things. One, so the Student Research Award program that we have through the State Archives is a great way for students to get involved in historical research and visiting repositories. And I also think, to Lavada's point, it's important that they see that, right? That they see that these things are in need of conservation and preservation and the fragility of them. Like, they're not going to last forever if we don't care for them and put resources into preserving them. So, and to see the importance of it, right? So once they're gone, and that students will gain an appreciation, whether they choose a path in history or not. I think as citizens and communities, and funders of different programs and organizations in their community, to see that museums and archives are an important resource for everyone, and they're community resources. I think it's important that they see that these are where these things are housed, these are how they're kept, and that you do have access, whether it be limited or not, depending on the condition of them. But I think it's very important that they go and they see them where they are in person and the importance of accessing them and the information they hold. So for sure.
And I just wanted to add, a lot of people talk about reparations. One of the things that the Netherlands is doing as reparations is helping people preserve, particularly the early 17th century documents that are being literally eaten away by iron gall ink. They have, where most conservators have to preserve that paper one page at a time, they're actually creating machinery that is allowing us to do 5 to 10 sheets of paper at a time. And this is very important. This also opens up for students a whole avenue of potential future work, because people don't think about not being an archivist or being a conservator, or it really opens up the world of possibilities that we desperately need for diversity within the history field on the conservation side.
That's a great point. Well, I think that I managed to get to most of the questions. And I want to thank all of you so much for joining us today. And I'd like to thank all of the people who logged on to listen and join us. I want to thank you. And this is our last online speaker series of the season, but it is our privilege to make these events available to you. And if you would like some more of the content that we create, you can email aptrust@nysed.gov to receive a free past issue of New York Archives magazine. And if you want to stay current with all of our upcoming events, please visit our website at nysarchivestrust.org. Thank you so much, Jordan, Christy, Jennifer, Levada, for an insightful presentation today. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.